Welcome back to Deep 404. I'd like to start today's show just by mentioning yesterday's video. Yesterday's video was about the first sighting of an Abrams tank, reportedly around Avdiivka. After I had put that video up yesterday, it became apparent that that video was in fact not from Avdiivka in Ukraine. It was from somewhere else, possibly in America, but had been reported as being a sighting of one of the Abrams in Ukraine. So I wanted to just make this clarification. I have since gone back on that video and on the description of the video, made a note of this. And this makes sense in that it was surprising that an Abrams would suddenly appear on the front line, particularly in Avdiivka, given the high bounty that sits on top of an Abrams tank. There are certainly bounties applied to pieces of kit like the Challengers, the Leopards, and the Abrams would have a similar sort of bounty on them where Russians would be targeting them and hunting them. So just an update there. That video yesterday, what I was talking about there, while a lot of what I said still stands, it appears as though the actual video I was referring to wasn't from Ukraine. Also, for those of you who've been following the channel, I'm back in the studio now. I was away for a couple of days with my family at the beach. It was lovely, beautiful chance to get into some of the clearest, most beautiful warm water that I've ever swam in. Some people did comment there were some challenges with the sound on some of those videos when I was operating off a laptop. Hopefully that's resolved now back here in the studio. Okay. Today, I want to start off with there's been a televised interview on a Italian state broadcaster, RAI, where President Zelensky of Ukraine has been interviewed. And in that interview, he speaks about a reset of his senior leadership. We've obviously been aware of talk over the last couple of weeks about him wanting to remove General Zaluzhny. Many people suggesting that him moving Zaluzhny would provide him with some sort of a scapegoat for the failed offensive. He would be able to shift him out, blame all of the failure in what should have been achieved or was hoped to have been achieved by now on the general rather than on the president himself. This, of course, is putting pressure on, as I have mentioned in a couple of earlier videos, if you look at the channel, the strong likelihood that we may see some form of a military coup rising in Ukraine. General Zaluzhny, disillusioned and disagreeing with President Zelensky on many topics. There has been to and fro about the request for 500,000 men for mobilisation, where Zelensky has said he's rejected that coming from Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny saying he never mentioned that number. They have conflicted over strategy around areas like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where reportedly General Zaluzhny has said we're losing too many men in these areas, it's time to let them go. We should be starting to fall back and build defensive positions, whereas Zelensky has overridden him and said, no, we can't lose Bakhmut, we can't lose Avdiivka. Obviously, we know Bakhmut was lost to the Russians and Avdiivka is approaching that point now. Actually, in the reporting around Avdiivka as of today, it appears that further Russian advances have been made. They are growing the number of dakas or houses within Avdiivka that they are holding. And pressure upon the final remaining supply route into Avdiivka has again been ratcheted up. And it seems very unlikely now that supplies would be reaching the remaining Ukrainian servicemen within Avdiivka. And that it seems very unlikely that they have a means of evacuating out of Avdiivka without suffering heavy losses if they were to try to do that. So there has been disagreement between the two men here. There has been a number of recent polls in Ukraine indicating that the general public's perception of trust and perhaps even desire to lead, without that question being asked specifically, is higher for General Zaluzhny than it is for President Zelensky. So with Zelensky knowing these things, he is looking at moving Zaluzhny out. This, of course, makes Zaluzhny concerned about his future. He's been offered reportedly some ambassadorship, which he's rejected. He's rejected twice now the desire of President Zelensky for him to resign, and has instead said, you need to fire me. So he's in a position where he'll be questioning his future, questioning the way that Ukraine is being led under Zelensky, and beginning to wonder if perhaps he could assume control. Given that he reportedly has a good standing within the military and via this public polling, this is something which I believe could happen. Now, just this week, Victoria Nuland, who's one of the big hitters for the US in terms of Ukraine and what happens there, an architect of the 2014 Maidan coup, she has recently been to Kiev, and many people feel that this may be her going there to just calm things down. Perhaps the Americans are okay with Zelensky firing Zaluzhny, but not now. They may not want to upset the apple cart right at this stage. They're trying to deal with the Middle East. Their focus perhaps isn't right on Ukraine. Having Zaluzhny instigate a coup would be bad in the press for them. It would look like they've lost control of the situation there. So she may well have been there, approached President Zelensky and said, look, we support you in what you're doing, but don't do it now. We'll see what happens here. There has been a lot of mumbling and grumbling from Zelensky over the last couple of weeks. He clearly wants to remove Zaluzhny, yet he hasn't been able to do it yet, and he hasn't just bitten the bullet and fired him publicly, and there are reasons for that. And as I say, the reasons are perhaps the blowback and likelihood that Zaluzhny may then instigate a coup against him. Okay, now in terms of funding, so one of the big problems that Zelensky has, President Zelensky of Ukraine has, is the lack of US funding coming his way. Now, there have been a couple of developments over the last 48 hours or so in Washington about this. One of them is that a $118 billion package has been announced by the Senate. This package ties together about $16 billion of aid for Israel, $60 billion of aid for Ukraine, some changes to border policy, and about almost $5 billion, I think effectively for Taiwan. It's for the Asian partners in the Asian region. I think primarily that $5 billion will be for support for Taiwan. Now, this is coming from the Senate. There's two layers of parliament in the United States. So it's the Senate and then the House. This bill that the Senate has put together for $118 billion needs to be approved and signed off by the House. The current Speaker of the House is Republican Mike Johnson, and I'll just read Mike Johnson's response, which he posted out on X or Twitter yesterday. Mike Johnson says, "I've seen enough. This bill is even worse than we expected and won't come close to ending the border catastrophe the president has created. As the lead Democrat negotiator proclaimed, under this legislation, the border never closes. If this bill reaches the House, it will be dead on arrival." So a lot of noise from Chuck Schumer in the Senate that they've got a great bill and that will go ahead and it's going to address the border concerns. The border concerns I've spoken about before, but briefly, the American southern border with Mexico is porous. There are thousands and thousands of people, undocumented, pouring in each day. Millions a year. Now, it sounds like a massive number, but just go and Google it and research it. This is true. There are some estimates that feel that during Biden's term, his 4 years, there may be as many as 12 million people will come across the border undocumented into the United States. Now, some of these people are seeking asylum and should be granted, somewhere to live in the United States. The United States is built on people migrating there. However, the challenge is that with people coming in undocumented, unchecked, unvetted, that you just don't know who is coming in and for why and for what purpose. And once they come in, you have a balancing act of, yes, they may find work, which is perhaps difficult for them to do in some areas because they're undocumented. But they may find work and add to the economy. But they also will then perhaps look for medical assistance and welfare and those type of things. And they're able to obtain that in some states, California. So these cause some challenges. Other things are that people are coming in from all over the world, not just Mexico. I think a lot of people think these are people from Mexico coming in. A large number are, but a large number are not. A large number are coming from the Middle East, are coming from Africa, and coming from China. Again, undocumented, with no ability to check their background, what they might be intending to doing, their skill sets, or even their health. Questions or reports of people on the border with tuberculosis, even one instance at least of someone reportedly with some sort of version of pox. I don't know if it's smallpox exactly, but these people, if they are travelling in without being checked, you run the risk of, I guess, supposed disease also coming in. So this sounds reasonable that the Americans would want to be able to control the flow of people into their country. I think most countries would like to be able to control that. This is one of the challenges that Europe has with its open borders policies in the EU, is that one nation may allow people in without checking, and then once they're into that EU nation, they can then travel off to other EU nations. The Republicans would like to lock the border down and get a handle on it. The Democrats would like to keep the border open, and the Democrats would like to keep the border open because they see the people coming across the border as future Democrat voters. This is not just me making this up. This is what the plan here is. There is good reason to believe that the Democrats actually have strategic plans around this. For example, Dick Durbin, senator, has suggested that anyone who is undocumented in America could join the armed forces. And if they join the armed forces, they would then grant them citizenship. So now you have an avenue for people from anywhere in the world to sneak into America, put your hand up and say, I'll join the army and receive citizenship. And then you can go and vote. Now, who would you likely vote for? Well, the party that allowed you in and did all that sort of thing. So the Democrats. What also happens, at least in some states in the United States, is this, and this is difficult to believe, but I believe this is true. You can register to vote in the United States. And when you register to vote, you have to put your hand up and say, I am an American citizen and I'm allowed to register. And if you do that and you are being false about that, then you can be punished for that. But that's all you've got to do, is say, I'm eligible to be an American citizen, I am an American citizen, and I should be able to vote, and you can register, and you can then vote. And without any checking done on that, this is a major loophole, which again, it is believed the Democrats are relying on, that they are able to allow people into the country. These people then turn up and say, I'd like to register to vote. Are you a citizen? Oh, yes, I am. Okay. They register and they vote. Now, the likelihood of them being chased down afterwards to find out if they really could vote or not, it's too late. The horse has bolted once the election has happened and those votes have been counted. So these are the challenges, and this is why the Republicans are saying we're not going to give any more funding to Ukraine unless we get, as the quid pro quo for that, we get some border security. Now, what has been offered by the Senate, the Democrats, is, okay, we want to give the President, Joe Biden, new emergency powers that he can shut the border down if the border's getting overwhelmed. And what they're overwhelmed means is if there's an average of more than 5,000 people per day undocumented coming across the border, then we would like to be able to shut it down. Now, 5,000 people a day works out over a year. It's about 1.8 million people a year. So Mike Johnson is looking at this and going, this is just not good enough. You're still going to allow 2 million people in at a minimum per year, probably 2.5 million up towards 3, because who's going to be counting the 5,000 across the whole borderline and taking those notes down really precisely to then report back to Joe and go, Joe, I think we're over this month. For that reason, they're saying this isn't going to happen. So that means funding for Ukraine isn't going to happen. Now, interestingly, there's another avenue opening up for funding for Israel, which I think demonstrates to us the importance, the positional importance of Israel and Ukraine as in the current global scene. Some House Republicans created a separate appropriation bill which would give $17 billion to Israel. Now, the challenge with this one is, so this is coming from House Republicans. The other one, the big bill, $118 billion, is coming from the Senate and primarily being driven by the Democrats in the Senate. But now, in order to fund Israel, Republicans from the House have produced their own appropriations bill where they're saying, we want to give $17 billion to Israel so they can continue bombing children in Gaza. And this one, however, is tied because the Republicans don't actually want to be spending a whole lot more money. They're saying, well, we will give this money to Israel, but Democrats, you need to cut your spending to the IRS. And so the Democrats are saying, well, we don't like that. So at the moment, funding to both Israel and Ukraine is tied up with these opposing forces on the sides of the House. But it's looking bad for Ukraine. It looks like it is likely that the delay in funding will extend. This, of course, causes big problems as we're talking now about the inability of Ukraine to be able to fund its public service, to be able to fund public institutions like fire brigades, government, that type of thing. But also, as Ukraine looks to, as President Zelensky is now looking to extend martial law and the general mobilisation, which he enacted back in February of 2022, as we're coming up to nearly the 2-year mark of this conflict, he's looking to extend that for another 90 days. As they look to then also increase with the new mobilisation bill, mobilise more people into the military, they're reaching the point where they are unable to do this because they can't afford to pay the salaries of the people in the armed forces. So that becomes a real problem because then you start to get to a position where people are not only less and less likely to want to fight, but you're not even honouring your agreement of having mobilised them, where you'd say, we will mobilise you, we will pay for you to go and fight. If you can't pay them, then they're starting to get to a position where they can not only just object, but they can actually say, well, you're in breach of your contract with us. You're not even paying us. We don't need to fight now. So big challenges there in Ukraine. There are some reports yesterday of some Ukrainian drones having struck a oil refinery in southern Russia. This is the Volgograd refinery of the Lukoil company. There have been a number of explosions reported over the last 2 weeks on oil processing plants or oil fields in Russia. Claimed to have been done by Ukrainian saboteurs and drones. These attacks, Russian oil fields are large. They're distributed. A lot of them are in the north, out of the reach of the Ukrainian drones. In fact, I talked a little bit about them a while ago in that some of the large oil companies have been granted last year permission by the Russian military to generate their own armed militias, to go beyond just normal security guards, but to armed militias. And some of these armed militias have been allowed to grow. Some of them are sent up north where the sea routes are starting to open up, and the Russians see the desire to allow the protection of their oil fields for exactly this reason, to stop drones attacking them, to stop saboteurs attacking them. Some of those PMCs, those private military companies being created by the oil and gas companies, are now contributing to the special military operation and are sending some of their servicemen to fight in this conflict. But the oil fields are, of course, a very strategic target to hit. If you could damage in its entirety one of the larger oil processing plants for the Russians, that becomes a big problem for them. These attacks which we're seeing are on such a limited scale that, yes, they will be slightly disruptive in an area, but over the whole, not enough to cause a problem at this stage. Other interesting news related to what's going on around Ukraine. Hungary had scheduled a vote yesterday to ratify in the parliament Sweden's accession into NATO. Now, Hungary is the last of the EU nations, NATO nations, to not have voted to allow Sweden in. Turkey has finally done it. Turkey was holding out. It had its deal with the United States around F-16s, and it looks like Turkey has signed because Joe Biden has said, yes, give them their F-16s. Hungary doesn't have a similar deal. with the US. But in yesterday's emergency vote that was called, it has been boycotted by the ruling party. So members of the ruling party, of Viktor Orban's party, did not turn up to the vote, and so the vote couldn't proceed. And so the Hungary's ratification of Sweden joining NATO has been delayed yet again. Hungary doesn't like what Sweden has said about Hungary. It's part of the reason. But there are, I think, bigger challenges here. Hungary clearly is not fully on board with NATO's position against Russia. Hungary still keeps communications with Russia. Hungary is the one nation that had attempted to stop the $50 billion EU grant going to Ukraine. And it was done on some very basic premises. They wanted to know where the money was going, what it was going to be spent on, and what good it would do given the current situation in Ukraine. Seems that ultimately they've been pushed over and that the money will be sent. But Hungary is that one nation which is not fully on board with all of this and still sees a benefit in communicating with Russia. And I think ultimately Hungary would like to stop the conflict against Russia and be able to just get back to trading with them normally. Sweden, of course, is the one Baltic nation around the Baltic Sea up there, which is not NATO. If we look at the map, there is Sweden with Norway and Finland around it, and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, all NATO. The one exception at this stage is Sweden, and directly across the Baltic from Sweden, the other exception, which is Kaliningrad, which is actually a Russian oblast, even though it's not physically connected to Russia. I have a video called Is Sweden Next? If you have a look on the channel, if you haven't seen that one, have a look at that. That one seems to be quite popular. People like what I'm talking about in there. Basically what I'm talking about is that Sweden's position right now, not being in NATO and being opposite Kaliningrad, is actually beneficial to the US and NATO if they wanted to attack Kaliningrad, try to take control of the Suwalki Gap, which is a gap between the westernmost point of Belarus and the easternmost tip of Kaliningrad. It's about a 60-kilometre little stretch of land between the border of Lithuania and Poland. Right now, Steadfast Defender is going on. This is NATO's largest exercises. They do every year. They have one. This is the largest one they've ever had. 90,000 NATO troops are in the area, and they're focusing around that Poland-Lithuania area. They're having war games, and their war games, I believe, are preparing for some sort of attack by Russia to take the Suwalki Gap. So again, have a look at that. Is Sweden Next? The Suwalki Gap is a very interesting area. 2 weeks ago, there were reports that there was some electronic warfare happening over the Suwalki Gap, and suddenly Polish GPS had been lost. This appears to have been the Russians in preparation for Steadfast Defender, as about 2 days ago I saw some reports that during the Steadfast Defender, or the operations that are starting around there, the preparations for it, there were complaints that NATO military was unable to use GPS in the area. So it looks as though the Russians might be using some electronic warfare up there to disrupt even these games at this stage. But it gives you an indication of what might happen around this area of the Suwalki Gap. If Russia feels that Kaliningrad is threatened, then they may want to drive through with Belarus and take the gap and create a land bridge. If NATO feels threatened that Russia will do that and will cut off then Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, isolate them, then they may want to take the gap. So I think this area is somewhere we need to keep an eye on. One topic which has been running throughout this conflict between Ukraine and Russia around the Black Sea is the ability to ship grain from Ukraine through the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv out to Europe, out to Western Europe, primarily Western Europe, but also to other nations, Africa and that sort of thing. There was the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was a deal brokered by President Erdogan of Turkey. That was not extended in 2023. Russia decided not to extend the deal again because they didn't feel that the Ukrainian side of the bargain was being upheld. They felt that there was the risk or the likelihood that Ukraine was actually using that grain corridor to perhaps smuggle arms out on the black market to generate revenue and to receive military supplies through the ports, when all that should have been moving through there was grain at that stage. There was also sabotage of a gas pipeline which ran from Russia, allowed Russia to export gas out through those ports. A number of things happened, and so the Russians said, we're not going to extend the deal anymore. They didn't cancel it, they just didn't extend it again. Anyhow, reports from Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan that President Erdogan would look to discuss a new grain deal when he meets with President Vladimir Putin in Turkey. This is supposed to happen later this week, I believe. This means that President Putin may travel to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan. And President Erdogan, always the deal maker, just starting to promote that he'll talk to President Putin about a grain deal. Now, on the global stage, having facilitated the prior grain deal, gave President Erdogan a sort of sentence of importance in this area, some power. Turkey, of course, controls the Bosphorus, and the Dardanelles, which are the entry points through Turkey into the Black Sea. So this is important. If grain travels through there, Turkey gets a cut. They get to charge for the freight going through there. I think it's somewhere around maybe $4 or $5 per kilogram or something. I can't remember exactly. There is a fee which is charged by the Turkish. So for them, it makes sense. If they can convince the Russians to allow the Ukrainians to ship things from what remains of the Odessa port or from Ismail up on the Danube, then they get some revenue as well. Whether this will go ahead, I don't know. I think it's probably unlikely that Russia is willing to do this, given the recent sinking of the Ivanets. I would suggest that the Russians are pretty adamant that at this stage the ports are out of action and they will remain that way until such time as Russia takes those ports and they become Russian territory, which is what I imagine is likely to be the ultimate result of this conflict. So some other exciting news. Tucker Carlson, ex-Fox News host who's now independent and raking in millions and millions of views per episode on X, he has travelled to Russia. He has reportedly travelled there with his film crew, and some people on X are just losing their minds that he's there because he's going to interview President Putin. Personally, I think this is a great deal for Tucker. If Tucker goes there, if he gets to sit down and just have a long, honest interview with President Putin, I think this will be a nightmare for the mainstream press in the West, because I'm fairly certain that it is likely to reveal President Putin in a talk with Tucker, which millions of people will watch, as a calm, conservative, logical leader, not some wild-eyed dictator who's looking to eat all of Europe, as the Western press is suggesting. We're still seeing NATO and Germany and Sweden and the UK and Poland all talking up in their public mainstream press that war's coming. You have to get ready for Russia. If Ukraine falls, you'll be next. I think we'll probably get the other side of the story in a convincing manner. And given that Tucker, if he puts it up on X, and I'm sure that Elon will allow him to do so, as I say, there will be millions who will watch it, as compared to the small fraction of people who would see the counter-argument now on the mainstream news sites like MSN and that type of thing. But yes, it's still sort of a touchy subject. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, was asked about this, and he has said, look, many journalists I'm paraphrasing, many journalists come into Russia all the time who I don't keep tabs on them. I can't say what they're doing. But I think the expectation is that there would be an interview with President Putin. interviews is what Tucker does. So I am personally hoping this does happen. I would love to see the interview. I hope that Tucker gets right into it. And I think that Tucker is probably someone who will ask questions that wouldn't be asked by Western mainstream journalists. There may still be some limitations on what he can ask, enforced by President Putin and his press secretary and that type of thing, perhaps. But I think we would still get a much wider ranging interview with Tucker there. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope it happens. Just a little bit on the front line. I'm just going to finish this up here pretty soon, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about these guys again, which is the TOS-1. These flamethrower systems. I just wanted to go through, talk a little bit about these because they're being used constantly on the front line. And so there's just something, a little bit of video to watch here. The TOS-1 system, a thermobaric shell. When they fire all 24 rockets in a salvo, they cover an area of up to 40,000 square meters. So if you imagine 100 meters, 100-meter sprint race, 100 meters wide by 400 meters long, that's the area we're talking about. So in the old school, it's about 110 yards by 440 yards. They're considered to be a sort of a fire suppression system. They're not aimed to destroy buildings or armoured vehicles or tanks and that type of thing. The prime effect they have is through high temperature and increased pressure. And so now I'm just going to read a little bit from the Journal of Military and Veterans Health. Thermobaric munitions are those weapons that are designed to produce enhanced temperature and pressure compared to conventional explosions that are often referred to as fuel-air explosives. Fuel-air explosives. They produce a much greater incidence of primary blast injury than conventional explosives, and this is their main mechanism of injury. Pulmonary effects. This is reading from a medical journal and referring to MELOR, medical journals, describe the mechanism of injury. When the blast wave hits on the bodies, when it passes through tissue interfaces, this sets up a stress wave that causes damage, particularly at the lobes, this is the lobes of the lungs, along the ribs on the side of the blast. If low velocity, it may rupture the more rigid bronchioles. If ruptured, these leak fluid into the lungs, which could lead to complete filling or shock lung or blast lung. Respiratory distress related to a non-fatal injury may not present itself for several hours, sometimes taking as long up to 48 hours. Cardiovascular effects. The cardiovascular system may be affected by air embolus in the heart or arteries. So the shock causes air to be forced out of the blood, I'm guessing, forming a bubble which then goes into the cardiovascular system. Auditory effects. In mild damage, the tympanic membrane is ruptured. In more severe cases, the membrane could disintegrate, requiring surgical intervention. In the worst cases, the inner ear is damaged, producing deafness and disabling pain, nausea, and balance problems. Gastrointestinal effects. Gastrointestinal damage is probably more common than is diagnosed and causes when stress waves cross pockets of gas trapped in the bowel. Bruising occurs in mild cases. In severe cases, perforation may occur. Due to leaking of bowel contents and hemorrhaging, this can occur up to 14 days after the injury. And then finally, central nervous system effects. The main injury to the central nervous system is from primary blast is a cerebral arterial gas embolism. And this may cause an unexplained deterioration in function or death. So these TOS-1 weapons are what is being used on the Ukrainian soldiers across the front line. When I looked for some videos to show this, there are a number of videos I chose not to show. They are ones which are reportedly showing the after effects. And just to describe them, views of drone footage, views of trenches with many men dead laying around, not laying in blast holes from artillery, but laying dead where they were, and many of them in areas, which gives the indication that what had killed them was this expanding ball of gas fuel which rolls out through the trenches, into dips and gullies, into open windows of vehicles, into dugouts, and then ignites with massive temperature and pressure and shock. And that is what has led to the death of these men. Just something, I think, for all of us who sit back in our chairs and watch this from afar, just to remember the real horror and terror and pain and suffering and hell on earth that these men are going through in their fighting. And I guess finally, to finish that thought up, a video that I saw today on X of what looked to be about 8 or 9 soldiers in the back of a truck. They look to be new, heading off, I imagine, to war for the first time in Ukraine, and they were all women. And that's the point that we have lowered ourselves to and reached in Ukraine conflict now, that truckloads of young women are being sent off, likely to their death or their disability. If lucky, they will somehow survive without major physical damage and death. They won't survive without emotional and traumatic scarring for the rest of their lives. It's very sad to see this sort of thing happening. It's sad enough with men, but sending young women to the front, it's just a terrible state of affairs. All right, I'll leave that there. If you are interested in the Deep 404, I am also on Twitter now. Sorry, on X now, so you can find videos and me mouthing off at people on X. I'll try and get another video out tomorrow for you, and look forward to talking to you again soon.